You, you. Good afternoon, sir. Thanks a lot for giving us this opportunity to interview you. In light of the Ayodhya verdict given on September 30th, we wanted to get your opinion since you are very closely associated with the entire movement. So without much ado, I would like to ask you a few questions and see where you stand on this entire episode.
Right, well, I can't say I've been associated with the movement as such. I have been very closely associated with the presentation of the evidence, in this sense that in the winter of 1991 I was in Delhi and I interacted very frequently with the scholars who were preparing the evidence for the mandir, for the temple. People like B.R. Grover, S.P. Gupta, Harsh Narayan, A.K. Chatterjee. I knew them all personally. Most of them are dead now. But I recognize some of my own ideas in the text that they presented.
Mm-hmm. What I would like to ask you is, as you said that you were involved in various capacities. What was your entire contribution to this Ram Janm Bhoomi movement from the initial days? What were your major contributions, if you could list it out?
Well, not that my role was very important, but I was the only foreigner who stood up for the historical evidence, who reminded the public that the idea that the Babri Masjid was built on a purposely destroyed Hindu temple is not some newfangled Hindu extremist invention. It's a solid tradition based on all the available evidence. It is only in the late 1980s that suddenly people started denying it. In the 1989 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, it is quite simply stated that the Babri Masjid was built after destroying a Rama temple. In today's edition, however, that is only given as the opinion of Hindu nationalists.
Okay.
Whereas you see in the 1980s, until then, there was no other opinion about it. It was simply the received wisdom, and it was based on a number of documents, as well as on archaeological findings from the 1950s, the 1970s, and then soon after, also in 1992, more pieces came to light, Hindu religious artifacts, and a very important inscription from the destroyed temple that said explicitly that it was built in about 1050 and dedicated to Lord Rama.
Yeah. These are some pointers that we will go into a bit later during the interview, where you mentioned about the historical facts and the pointers. But one interesting point you made initially is you were one of the only Westerner, if not among a few, but probably the only Westerner who strongly believed in the fact that this entire site was basically the Ram Janm Bhoomi from day one. So how did you get involved into this process? How did you become the first white person, Western person to get involved in this?
Well, it must have been December 1989 that I met Sitaram Goel. Sitaram Goel was a publisher at the time. He had his publishing house, Voice of India, specifically for books about Hindu awakening, about history. And it is not really by coincidence that I met him. It went like this. He had written this book, History of Hindu-Christian Encounters, which gives a pretty complete overview of the salient points of conflict, mainly between Hindus and Christians. And I found the book in a bookstore in Daryaganj with Mr. Uppal, and a few days later I went back to the bookstore and he asked me if I'd liked the book, and I told him that I was quite enthusiastic about it. It was quite an eye-opener. And then he said offhand, the writer of this book, he works just down the block. And then he picked up the telephone and asked, is Mr. Goel there? And the secretary told him, well, he'll be here in the afternoon. So that afternoon I went there, and it was, so to speak, love at first sight. I was very impressed with Mr. Goel. He knew so many things, and he, especially, it's not just that he knew data, but he had a very developed perspective. You see, he understood the issues. And so I had already heard a little bit about the ongoing controversy, Ayodhya and other Hindu-Muslim affairs, like the then fresh Salman Rushdie book, The Satanic Verses, that was being banned in India. And so he explained to me who was who in the field. Like, for example, everybody always talks about the RSS, the Sangh Parivar, as the Hindu nationalist organization. And it is always pretended that this Hindu activism only exists because somebody invented it. Some organization decided to make itself important by launching Hindu nationalism. Whereas in reality, there are certain real problems that make people want to bring about certain changes in the Indian polity. And one of the organizations that has taken that concern to heart is the RSS and its daughter organizations. But it is not the only possible approach, and perhaps not even the best one. In fact, Sitaram Goel was a great critic of the RSS. Anyway, the one important thing to remember there is precisely not to identify Hindu concerns with the organized Hindu movement, but instead, you see, to look at those concerns themselves. Now, about the Ayodhya affair, it doesn't take very much knowledge to understand that what had happened in Ayodhya was a very typical situation. Muslim invaders destroying places of worship has happened in many places. You see some of the Indian academics who try to deny this history of temple demolition always try to make the audience focus on India and only on India, and then they tell these funny stories about that in fact it's the Hindus who demolished Buddhist temples and so on, and the Muslims only copied Hindus to the extent that they even destroyed anything at all, which they also try to put in doubt. First of all, of course, it is not true that Hindus destroyed Buddhist temples, but more importantly, when the Muslims arrived in India, they already had quite a history, including a history of iconoclasm, of destroying the religious objects and buildings of other communities, starting in Mecca, where the Kaaba was taken over by Muhammad. It was an existing place of worship of the pagans, the polytheists of Arabia, and apart from the black stone, there were 360 idols, as they say in English, murtis. And so Muhammad and his nephew Ali together destroyed each one of them and turned an existing place of worship of another religion into a mosque. So this has happened in many places, and it was an existing tradition by the time Mahmud Ghaznavi and Muhammad Ghori and so on came in India. There is a story about Mahmud Ghaznavi. It is in one of the Sufi poets, either Jalaluddin Rumi or Fariduddin Attar, I think the second one, that when he was about to destroy the Somnath temple, the local Hindus offered to ransom the main idol of the temple. They said, you see, we are willing to pay you this much gold if you leave the idol intact. And he said, well, on the day of judgment, when I have to appear before Allah, I want to be known as an idol breaker, not as an idol seller.